politics, and pop culture.
What's up, world? It's your boy, Mike Muse. Welcome to an episode of the Mike Muse Show. I am so excited, literally, to be in conversation with my next guest, plural, with the S on the end of that. I know two of them extremely well, and I am very familiar with the other two's work because how can you not be familiar with their work? And so this is going to be an interesting conversation because this is part activism, part advocacy, also too part family and part friendship. And I am so proud of these ladies for what they have decided to do. Advocacy isn't easy. Taking a stand is not easy, and taking a position isn't easy. It's easy to hide behind Twitter and Instagram and all the great things that we enjoy having the protection of Section 230 on. But more so, it's even difficult to take it to the next step and to actually create change, and create a nonprofit and create a foundation and say, you know what, I'm going to stand up and say something in the face of that might be seem controversial as we're leaning into more racial reckoning and polarizations and racial identity. And so, but these four Black women have leaned into their identity, they leaned into their strengths, and they have decided to create a movement called She Will Rise. And it's a nonprofit organization that is focusing on making sure that a Black woman is appointed to the Supreme Court of the United States of what we call America. So without further ado, I want to introduce you to our fantastic co-founders, Sabrina Williams, April Rain, Kimberly Tignor, and Brandy Colander. What is happening, ladies?
Hey, Mike.
Thank you so much for having us. We're excited.
I want to take Mike on the road with us. That was the most excellent.
He is good. Listen,
we're done. Talk about adding a meal to the crew. We need it.
Listen, no, I mean, just because everything I said, you know, as they say, find the line. What you guys have done is incredible, and it is not easy. And yes, Black women, we've always been saying, is a backbone of political movements, political change. That is very true. But every now and again, it's fascinating to see how much further Black women can keep going. And so just when you thought your guys are done, y'all just keep going. And I'm just so thankful for that, just as a human being, as a friend to you guys all, but just on behalf of our culture and our society, because it isn't easy. And so with that, I want to be, cognizant of time and make sure everyone gets a chance to talk. Kim, talk to me a little bit why you guys decided to come together. I mean, for all the obvious reasons, but what was more the driving factor that, you know what, enough is enough. Let's go ahead and take a stance and formalize this movement here.
Honestly, Mike, it was, last year during the summer of all summers, right? Last summer was just a pressure cooker lesson in all of the systemic issues that marginalized communities are dealing with. And, when now President Biden and Sanders made their commitment to nominate the first Black woman, it was an issue that I'd worked on for a long time that had always been so important to me. And I was singing with joy to hear this commitment being made. But much to my own frustration or disappointment, it just didn't pick up, right? It just didn't pick up in the news, in the community. It just wasn't our focus. And so, I reached out to three other very dynamic Black women and told them, I think that we need to do work to help our communities connect the dots, right? As our communities are doing activism around policing reform, around voting, around housing discrimination, affordable care, environmental justice, all of these issues, we need to start integrating the federal courts and the Supreme Court into those talking points and into those lists of demands. And so I reached out to three dope sisters who have been working with me since in really thinking about how to power this movement and how to engage communities of color on the issues surrounding the federal courts and the Supreme Court at large.
So April, I wanted you to take this question because, I advocate for Black men in my writing, and the kickback and pushback I get is unbelievable. It becomes visceral when you take a stand for Black men and all the othering comes into play. Why did you guys choose to lean into Black women specifically, but then further going from plural to singular, a Black woman on the Supreme Court?
Because in my mind, Black women are the backbone of the entire world. We do it all very often for little or no pay or thanks or, or even recognition. But what we know, what we've seen is that Black women always leave the door open for the person behind them, and they always lift as they climb. And so having a Black woman on the Supreme Court says to me that our experiences will be finally acknowledged in a way that they haven't been before. So it just made sense. President and then candidate Biden made this commitment, and it became easier, right? So what we're doing with She Will Rise is creating a groundswell of support that said, this is what Biden wants to do. Hopefully, let's make the process a little bit easier for him, because we've seen with the recent nominations and confirmations for other Black women within the judiciary that it hasn't been just a rubber stamp of approval, despite the fact that these Black women have been eminently qualified across the board. So it makes sense for us to say, even if there isn't a vacancy right now, we know that there's going to be one. And so let's not, put out the bat signal when that happens and try to create something from scratch. Let's have a continuing conversation about how it's important to have diverse experiences throughout the federal judiciary, but especially on the Supreme Court, which is the final arbiter of the law in this land.
So, Sabrina, I want to come to you because April is leading me to you when she talks about experiences. I've been thinking about on the debate stage, we heard a lot about, not even just debate stage, but throughout the course of the debates, throughout the course of society and social construct when it comes to women's health and reproduction, but in particular to women, Black women, and the Black mortality rate when it comes to birth and child laboring and what that looks like and how Black women just aren't believed in the hospital. You coming from the Department of Health and Human Services, why is that important for you? And then what do you think a Black woman on that court can do to help with that narrative shift?
So I having my own experiences and doing maternal child health work and knowing that not just Black women, but the United States as a whole has dismal rates when it comes to infant mortality and maternal mortality. And so having a woman on the Supreme Court, even if you haven't had a child, you know someone who has, someone who's gone through this. Especially in the Black community, it's that secret that happened and you don't talk about it. And we all my grandmother had an experience, my aunt had an experience. We have these shared experiences in the room that aren't talked about. And so even though they may not be talked about on the court, we have a shared experience. And so making those and amplifying why maternal and reproductive rights are important and should be a personal decision, having someone on the court who can give that perspective and grace, I think would be, it goes without saying that it would definitely assist the marginalized Brown and Black women and women as a whole.
Yeah. Well, and speaking of marginalization, Brandy, I want to come to you. And I know in your wheelhouse, you worked with U.S. Department of Interior, advancing policies and regulations, the land and minerals and management. These are all things I actually love to talk about, ironically. The EPA is one of my second favorite agencies after the Agriculture Department, because these are the issues that Black people get ignored, but we have the most things to lose when it comes to that. And shout out to Secretary Haaland for being the Secretary of Interior. Shout out to Native American brothers and sisters who have a chance now to have their voice really heard. And so I look at you and I think about this, I'm thinking about like environmental protection when it comes to race, the environment, asthma, all the things that kind of Sabria was just talking about. With your lived experience, why was this important for you to come on and talk, have a Black woman on that seat from your background and how it can impact marginalized community as a whole from those areas?
No, I appreciate it. I think, Sabria has really done pioneering work from a health equity perspective. And, I sort of am trained to think about it more from a natural resources management perspective and thinking about us within an ecosystem, how all these things touch and where there are just inherent inequities and frankly neglect, and what that looks like. And the way I see it, Mike, you've got, I think last year, it was 52 studies that came out that really started to draw more of a causation and correlation between climate and Black women were sort of the litmus demographic that demonstrated we are dying disproportionately, we are having smaller babies, we are having more miscarriages, reproductive issues are at really, basically going back to the period in time of the slave trade. And so at a moment where you have a billionaire putting himself on the moon, right? You just have to ask yourself, why has this gone completely ignored? And then you think about representation. And so as a Black girl from, whose 96-year-old grandmother was a sharecropper in Suffolk, Virginia. So very much sort of understanding the vestiges of the Great Migration and how a lot of Black folks in America have been able to generationally continue to progress. I think about it a lot through the lens of natural resources and management and climate. And it's impossible to divorce the obvious representation gaps there as well. And this is an opportunity. And I think for this cohort, and I just really have to sort of, again, highlight Kim, who is the daughter of a judge who understands this space, who studied this space, and she understands the importance and the long game of having women of color advocate for women of color, because that is what I think is sort of very unique and special, Mike, about this effort. There are a lot of advocacy organizations, legal organizations that have been in this game far longer than the She Will Rise campaign, but the composition is not the same, the focus is not the same. And so we're excited about partnering with them, but we're adding something different to the conversation. And we're specifically trying to educate a demographic that we just don't think has been catered to and is thirsty for this information.
I couldn't agree more, especially when it comes to environmental justice. That is a bag that I love the most. Audience, for those of you who are listening versus watching, you can't see my smile because we talked a little bit before we came on air, and I was just saying this is going to be the easiest interview I've ever done because I don't have to do much, and they're pretty much going to lead the conversation. And Brandy did just that. She teed up for Kim to come in next, so I'm just here basically, just to help facilitate and make sure everyone takes a turn. Everyone is polite. So Kim, with that, I want to come to you because when Brandy was talking about a daughter of a judge, Cyber, I didn't know that. Kim is spam, didn't even know that. Shout out to your moms. I want to talk to now then you, Kim, about pipeline and process, because I think sometimes we're just not aware of both. When it comes to how these things work. Civics have been taken out of high school. We just don't understand government. And a part of it is not our fault. Honestly, it's just, we just don't learn. I don't want you guys to log off when I say this next comment, but hold out to the end. That is the reason why I'm a fan of, I shouldn't say a fan, let me be careful with that. I believe that Mitch McConnell will go down as one of the most strategic tacticians of politicians of our time. The way he intentionally made sure that the judiciary was as conservative as possible on the federal court. So no matter what happens, no matter Democrat, Republicans in the Oval Office, the guardrails of conservacy will always be in position when it comes to judgeships on the courts. And I think from that is a very strategic and tactical decision that he knew very intentionally. So talk to me then, Kim, about the pipeline process of this, right? Like how does someone, rise to the Supreme Court, right? Is it you start the circuit, the appeal, the appellate? Talk a little bit about that. And then what is needed to make sure that Black women are into that pipeline in order to be considered for that next step, which is to be appointed as a Supreme Court nominee?
So what you'll find out, Mike, if you sit and tolerate me long enough, is that I am obsessed with this concept, right? And Sabria, April, Brandy have heard me go on and on and on about the disparate impact that the confirmation process itself has on people of color, women, and then women who sit at that intersection, right? And so, I started to do a lot of work on the Senate confirmation process under former President Obama, where for the first time, where it was history in the making, right? Where we saw an unprecedented amount of women, people of color, these diverse candidates navigating this nomination or this confirmation process, right? And so just as background, we make sure I actually do what Mike asked me to do, which is, so if you are nominated, right, by the president for a position, you are then going to have to make it through a Senate confirmation process, right? And essentially what we have is that when you're making it through the Senate confirmation process, you are not able to respond to or fight any of the attacks or critiques that are coming after you. And so what you see during that time is an activation, a key and strategic activation of different networks that will then advocate and push to make sure that you make it through that process. And it's a mixture of backroom phone calls, right? Of high, very influential power brokers that are making calls on your behalf. And then, the grassroots efforts of folks calling their senators and making sure that they are supporting the candidates that you care about. So what you see at the intersection of gender bias and race bias is you see this disparate impact where we watched under Obama as exceptional candidates, women of color, Black women, Black people. Black people were 3 times less likely to be successful in that confirmation process than their white counterparts, right? And so you just watch them just kind of hanging there in the wind. And they were. If you go and look at the list of failed nominees, you'll see some of the amazing Black women that did not now make it through that process. And just to kind of touch base on your earlier question, Mike, of why Black women now, a number of those Black women then joined the civil rights movement and then started to protect the same democracy that we're seeing that we don't even see proper representation in, right? So I'm talking about our Anita Earls. I'm talking about, listen, if you look at who saved the democracy and who was out here fighting for it, it was Black women, right? Sherilyn Ifill, Kristen Clark, Fatima Groves-Graves. These are the sensational Black women that are protecting us, and yet, and still, we have failed to make sure that they're properly represented throughout every branch of the democracy, and the Supreme Court and the federal judiciary. And
I want to lean.
But I know, Mike. I'm gonna
get. Oh, keep going. Sorry, no.
I'm getting on your nerves. So, but there's one last point, right? And that is, don't laugh at me. But these pipelines, they are so fragile. That is the problem. And to your point, right, about McConnell, is that he understands how fragile these things are, right? Because it is the coming together of expertise, age, who was in office, and who was in power, right? And so it's not just about, that's why Ketanji Brown Jackson is such an amazing thing. This is a woman who was nominated first by Obama, right? And so she was first placed on the district court. She is now, and then she sat there, did sensational work, has done tremendous work for civil rights, for the civil rights movement. And now, when Biden has entered in, she has now been placed to the DC circuit, which is the #1 pipeline for the Supreme Court. But these things are fragile. Had Ketanji Brown Jackson not made it through successfully, we wouldn't even have her to plug into this pipeline. And if we don't keep the Senate, by the time a vacancy opens up, we won't be able to plug her in, because then there's questions of when someone ages out and when we'll actually have the votes to be able to get them into the Supreme Court. So it's all that to say that the one thing that I will give McConnell credit for is to understand that you have to constantly feed these pipelines. And that's why it's so important that why we're cheering at She Will Rise for every Black woman that is placed into those judicial pipelines and placed on the federal judiciary, because it just brings us one step closer to seeing our Black women justice.
I know it's hard to give people. Sure.
I'm sorry. I just wanted to double tap just for a second. And so that is one pipeline. The other pipeline is, from where do you pull the talent from the Supreme Court, right? It's not just the DC circuit. And so part of the push for She Will Rise is that we're saying not everybody needs to come from an Ivy League. Not everybody needs to have previously clerked for a Supreme Court justice. It would be incredibly impactful to have someone who worked as a public defender, who was down there working with marginalized folks every single day to finally sit on the highest court of the land. Not everybody, it would be wonderful to have someone from a historically Black college or university and law school to be able to sit on the highest court of the land. But unfortunately, through the years, there's been a very narrow focus of from where people who make it to the Supreme Court are pulled.
A lot.
So that takes me to, I want to thank you, April, for that. I know, Brandy, you want to chime in just for a little bit, but just for interest of time, I want to make sure I want to land the plane in a certain direction here. So Kim, though, to April's point into what you're saying, I know everything isn't linear, and you gave us a lot of, insider baseball talk for people like us who do this on a daily basis. But for the audience who are just not familiar with this, let's try and make it as linear as possible. So I'm going to ask you some very elementary questions. I apologize for insulting your whole intelligence. And I know it's not linear, it's different ways around it, but does one need to sit like at the circuit court, then go to an appellate court? Like, what is a traditional path that you can explain this so our audience can understand where the pipeline has gone wrong, where we need to other areas to be increased? I know you guys are focused on other areas too as well. So if you can just take us through a linear as possible path of a traditional background of a Supreme Court justice.
I mean, so one of the
if that's possible.
Yes and no, right? I think that the most interesting thing that you'll find in a lot of the federal judiciary pipeline work that's being done is that there are all sorts of different paths to the federal judiciary. So for example, Ketanji Brown Jackson, she was on the Sentencing Commission, right? And then from the Sentencing Commission, she then went to the federal district courts. Kagan was a professor. Justice Kagan was a professor prior to joining the Supreme Court. There are different paths, right? And I do think that there's really important work being done around rethinking and being more, casting a broader net as to who it is that we should be putting on these courts. And this is, we just had this past week, there's been conversations with the Judicial Commission that's talking about the fact that we need to end our obsession with these Ivy League pedigrees and to really rethink what it means to have an inclusive federal court system and Supreme Court. So now I
understand now when you were talking about so now that we know there is no linear direction, it only reinforces what you were saying earlier. Now that those of us who are not familiar with the process, it now underscores the idea of how arbitrary the selection is, and then how inherently the biases associated with overlooking Black women, because there is no traditional linear path. So then it's all subjective. And so because it's subjective, then therefore the biases have been inherently planted. And then that's even more important, and why She Will Rise is more important, is to bring that advocacy to make them feel uncomfortable when they choose to intentionally forget that a Black woman is on the list. Brandy, Kim just mentioned something really interesting that I didn't even think about, which underscores even the importance of this conversation around Justice Breyer, his retirement or not, because I wasn't thinking about the Senate confirmation that is needed. Currently, we're 50-50, +1 goes to Vice President Harris, but who knows what's going to happen in the midterm elections in the next year and a half. Talk to us about how you guys are paying attention to this watch, and the critical juncture we're at with timing for you guys, and the movement that you guys are trying to create with seating a Black woman.
I appreciate the question. I'm going to be sensitive here because I don't think it's beneficial to poke this bear. I think Justice Breyer is clear that he has a platform and an obligation to, execute his public service duties in the public's trust. We sincerely hope that we have learned the importance of curating that so that there is a smooth transition. And frankly, just as a Black woman who's hoping to see in her lifetime, and certainly before my daughter's lifetime, a Black woman for the first time in our country's history, putting ourselves in the best position possible to do that. We know what's true. We also know that clerks for next year have been selected. So here we are standing at the ready to be there when it's time. And there are, tons of Black women who have demonstrated the exceptional performance and ability and qualifications. There are two things that I think are worth lifting up in the context of this question, though, Mike. One is kind of going back to April's point around qualifications. And I think there is often a narrative around qualifications with Black women, performance with Black women, that we really want to make sure we, as a cohort of Black women advocating for a Black woman for the first time in this capacity, get an opportunity to influence and share that story and perspective. Kim has been incredibly intentional about Black women creators being the faces of all of the things that are what She Will Rise embodies, the visuals, the swag, all of it. But then the other thing is just on pipeline, and when I was in the Obama administration with the White House Council on Environmental Quality, and we were looking at pipeline for environmental judges. The fragility of pipelines, we have to give it to Senator McConnell. He really has been exceptional in that regard. There is a long game strategic approach. And I'm lifting that up, not to lift him up as much as to lift up the fact that we are playing the long game here. We are committed and invested in doing this to make sure that this becomes real. And there's not just a first, but like there are many hers. And so when you think about the equity issues, Mike, it's just thinking about like, what does pipeline actually look like? Are you telling someone who's a partner at a law firm making millions of dollars a year who's Black, and what it took for them to be them to then go be a judge? And what does that then do to, you know, to wreck the ecosystem here, to create more here? It really does become, you have to be intentional about grooming these pipelines, creating these clerkships, and to April's point, not just looking at the same traditional institutions.
So Bree, I'm coming to you next. So Brandy, I thank you for bringing that into the conversation. And my audience knows this all the time about, you know, I'm a student of politics. Like I love politics. And when you do it, you're able to take your emotions out and actually learn. And so by taking my emotions out, I can study the ways and strategy of McConnell. If you're a lover of strategy, you have to be able to take your emotions out of things in order to study the strategy. You may not like the outcomes of it, but was the strategy successful for what they envision it to be? And so I think even as my audience is listening, they always know that sometimes suppressing your emotions, you're able to learn, step back, and engage in a long game. For far too often, I think our people meaning Black people, are so short strategy and short-sighted and so emotional in the moment that we lose sight of the long game. And so thank you for bringing that into this conversation. So Bria, with that being said, with the long game, you know, your background, you're all about engagement and events and making things big. And I'm sure Kim has protected all of you guys' IP. But how are you wanting She Will Rise, and how do you want people to engage with the great work that you guys are doing?
So first, we need you to go to the website, sisterscotus.org, and sign our petition. That is the first way you can become engaged. But also, I feel like we are also being very intentional and not limiting this to the folks that, so I'm the only lawyer, non-lawyer of the group, right? So we are being very intentional about that, trying to make this as plain as it can be, so folks can understand why there is a long game, why we're doing this, why the judiciary is important, why the other two branches of government are important, why the Supreme Court and having a Black woman on the Supreme Court and other and representing other judiciary is important. So I think are making it, while we want our judges to be diverse, we want our audience to be diverse. It's not just the top tier, right? We want or when I say top tier, I mean that top 1% of income. We want everybody to become engaged. And that's how, I didn't want to say his name, Mitch McConnell has become successful, right? Because everybody on the right, no matter what their socioeconomic background, recognizes that one of the number one goals is the courts. You ask anybody, why are you the courts? It's the courts. And so we need to rally around our folks. And that, I believe, is what we're doing on all levels, and letting them know we need to rally around the courts.
Yeah. Well, April, you're going to close this out, but if I would have known we're going to bring his name up that much, I would have instituted a drinking game at the beginning of the show. Every time we say Mr. McConnell, take a drink. Because I think people are going to need a drink every time we hear him say their names. Are cringing, I'm sure. But April, you have had such success with creating and the founder of #OscarsSoWhite. We just heard Sabria talk about the call to action of going to the website and getting more people engaged who are just not in the legal space. For you with hashtags, you are the queen of hashtag and call to action. What is it you want the hashtag She Will Rise to embody? And what do you want the audience to be left with as we conclude?
Thank you for asking that. I think what we want is for people to engage with the movement and the hashtag and understand how it is personally impactful what happens on the Supreme Court, and you can pick your issue, whatever, if you're a 1-issue person or you're an 8-issue person, it doesn't matter. It is going to be impacted in one way or another by the last arbiter in the land, the Supreme Court. So if it's education, environment, environmental justice, reproductive rights, voting rights, civil rights, they all come under the Supreme Court. And so we want people to understand that, all politics, and all judiciaries are also local. And so, yes, please go to sistascotus.org and sign the petition. You can provide your email address if you want so that you can stay in contact with us as we're having these conversations. You can follow us. We are Sista SCOTUS, SISTASCOTUS on all platforms. So you can follow us and stay in the know with what we have going on. And then talk to your folks, socialize this as we socialize any other issue. Because, this is the commitment that President Biden has made, but we know that he's going to need support. We're going to need people to call their senators and say, yes, confirm this person, confirm the first Black woman to the Supreme Court. And we don't want to wait until we have to put up the bat signal because there's finally a vacancy before people get motivated. There are things that people can be discussing now as they sign the petition, they follow us on social media, and we continue to have these really important conversations.
I couldn't think of a better way to end. Brandy, Kim, Sabria, April, thank you for your advocacy. Thank you for stepping up to the plate to making sure that a Black woman is seated to the United States of America Supreme Court. Thanks for all you guys do, ladies. Can't wait to watch the movement. I'm sure she will be seated soon with the four of you at the helm. All right, well, take care, guys. Be good. And audience, that's the show. What a show. I hope you're not too drunk when you replay this again. That's because you're going to need to learn everything that Kim just said. So let's institute the drinking game now for the on-demand and for the replay when you watch the game. Okay, cool. Peace.